Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're tackling something today that I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with as your IT company's growth. It's this whole thing about how to define your company's architecture and, how to make sure that your tech can handle all that exciting, but sometimes kind of scary growth, right?
Hmm.
So, to help us unpack all this, we're diving into defining the IT company's architecture, a comprehensive strategy, and we'll be pulling out the most important insights to help you build that tech framework that not only keeps up, but actually helps propel you forward.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think often gets overlooked in all of this is that architecture in a company, like in a tech company, is not that different from building, well, an actual structure.
Yeah,
Because you wouldn't just start piling up bricks to build a skyscraper, hoping it all works out, right?
definitely not. You need a good blueprint, a strong foundation. I mean,
Yeah,
who wants to risk their company collapsing like a house of cards? And I imagine that's even more important for a growing IT company.
exactly. And this source we're looking at breaks it all down into four, I guess you could call them layers of a company's architecture. And they're all kind of interconnected, right? So you've got your enterprise architecture, which is all about aligning, your tech with your business goals. And then there's the software or application architecture piece, focusing on how each app is designed and how they all like talk to each other, integrate.
Okay, so that's two and all about the apps themselves, but then there's the infrastructure side too.
Right, exactly. So the third one is infrastructure or deployment architecture, which covers your cloud setup, servers, all of that good stuff.
Making sure the lights stay on, so to speak.
Yeah. And then last but certainly not least is data architecture. And that's the part that makes sure all your data is, flowing smoothly, securely, and that you can actually use it.
So we've got these distinct layers, but they're all kind of working together, right? It really drives home the point that defining a company's architecture is a strategic decision. It's a business decision, not just something you throw to the tech team and say, figure it out.
Absolutely. And this source, I mean, they really put a lot of emphasis on the role of the principal software engineer,
Mm.
especially in those, early stages of growth when you might not have a dedicated architect on board yet.
They're the ones who really need to make sure it all comes together. Okay, so we've talked about the what. Now let's dig into the who. What makes the principal software engineer's role so crucial in all of this, especially, like you said, when a dedicated architect might not be there yet?
Well, they basically become the architect by default, right? They're the ones who have to be able to look at all the pieces and make sure that all the technological parts work together, in harmony. The source really digs into three areas they need to master. First, there's understanding the business, and then assessing the current state, like where are things at right now. And finally, designing that target architecture. What should it all look like down the road?
That sounds like a pretty tall order. Let's break those down a bit, starting with understanding the business. I'm guessing it's about more than just, knowing how to code.
You got it. Think about it this way. Let's say your company wants to expand internationally, right?
Okay, going global.
Right. Well, the principal engineer needs to be thinking, okay, how do we make sure that our tech, our architecture can handle different languages, currencies, time zones, all of it?
Yeah.
Even things like complying with data regulations, which can be totally different from one country to the next.
You're speaking my language, thinking globally from day one. But
Yeah.
let's move on to assessing the current state. What should a principal engineer be looking for when they're doing that kind of evaluation?
So they've got to put on their objective hat and really look at the systems they already have and identify, what's working well, but more importantly, what are the weaknesses, the potential bottlenecks? The source mentions this idea of technical debt, which I think is a really helpful analogy.
I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
So it's basically like this. Imagine instead of, going back and fixing some underlying problem in your code, like a design flaw or something, you just keep putting band-aids on it, patching it up over and over.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. And in the short term, it might seem easier, but for a growing company, especially in the IT world, that kind of debt can really come back to bite you. You end up with slower development, more errors, harder to integrate new features. The list goes on.
It's like delaying the inevitable,
Yeah.
right? Eventually, all those little band-aids are going to fall off. Okay, so you've assessed the current state. You've got a handle on the business needs. Now comes the fun part, designing that target architecture. What does that actually involve? And what are some of the things you really have to think about?
This is where you get to dream a little,
Yeah.
but with, a solid dose of reality mixed in. It's about creating these high-level diagrams that kind of map out all the different components of your system, how they'll work together, how the data will flow through it all. And scalability is huge, GE. You need a system that can handle more users, more data, more traffic, you name it. as your company grows.
Laying the groundwork for a system that's flexible can adapt down the road, right? I know the source talks about transitioning to a microservices architecture as one approach. Can you tell us a bit more about what that actually means?
Sure. So imagine your application, right? Maybe it's a big monolithic thing, kind of like a giant cruise ship.
Yeah, I'm picturing it.
Now imagine if instead of one big ship, you break it down into a fleet of smaller interconnected boats, each one with its own specific job to do. That's kind of what you're doing with microservices. Each one is like a mini application that handles just one specific function.
Interesting. So instead of one giant thing to maintain, you have all these smaller pieces.
Exactly. And that means individual teams can own and scale those services kind of independently, which will really speed up development and make things less risky when you're deploying new features.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds great in theory, but I imagine switching over to a microservices architecture from whatever you have in place is a pretty big undertaking, right? What are some of the things companies need to consider before they jump into that kind of transition? It really seems like transitioning to a microservices architecture could be, a game changer for a lot of companies, especially in the IT world. But it also sounds pretty complex, like there are a lot of moving parts. So, what are some of the things companies should really be thinking about, potential challenges or pitfalls to avoid when they're making that kind of shift in their architecture?
Yeah, it's definitely not something you just like flip a switch and suddenly you're on microservices. One of the biggest things is making sure that your team, your developers, actually have the skills and experience to work this way. The different mindset, different tools, often than building a more traditional monolithic application. You need people who are comfortable with things like, containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, all those buzzwords you hear about.
So there's a learning curve potentially for the whole company, not just the tech team. And I'm guessing it's not just about like technical skills either. The source we're looking at really emphasizes communication and collaboration, especially when you've got all these different teams working on different microservices, right?
Oh, 100%. If you don't have clear communication, well-defined boundaries between teams, it can quickly devolve into total chaos. It's like, imagine trying to build a house where every contractor is just doing their own thing without talking to each other.
Mm.
You need clear ownership. You need to define those APIs, how those services are going to talk to each other, make sure everyone's on the same page about things like versioning, dependencies.
It sounds like, yeah, meticulous planning is not an overstatement here. But if you can pull it off, those benefits, more agility, faster development, less risk, I mean, those are pretty compelling, especially for a company that's in growth mode.
So stepping back a bit from the specifics of microservices for a second, what are some other really crucial factors that this source highlights when you're thinking about, future-proofing your architecture, making sure it can really support your company's growth over time?
Well, we've got to talk about security. I mean, it cannot be an afterthought. You can't just tack it on at the end. You really want to build security into the foundation of your architecture from day one. And that's even more important with microservices.
Because you've got all these different pieces communicating with each other,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not just about building a wall around the whole thing. Exactly. So thinking about things like, how is each microservice authenticating requests? You don't want one weak link giving someone access to your whole system. Securing those communication channels between services, usually using HTTPS or TLS to keep things encrypted. And having good logging and monitoring at each step so you can spot problems quickly if something does happen.
So it's like a multi-layered approach to security, right? Okay, so security is obviously huge, but a secure system isn't much good if it's slow and clunky. What about designing for performance? Making sure your system can actually handle it as your user base grows. You get more customers, more data, all of that.
Absolutely. You've got to be thinking about scalability from the get-go.
Like making sure your website doesn't crash if you suddenly get like a million hits because you were mentioned on some big tech blog or something.
Exactly. But it's more than just handling those like peak moments. You want consistent performance day in and day out. So the source talks about things like load balancing, using caching mechanisms, making sure your database is optimized.
All those technical things that make it run smoothly behind the scenes.
Right. But it's not just about the tech itself. You also need to be constantly monitoring your system's performance, identifying bottlenecks, making adjustments as needed, and doing performance testing both while you're developing and once you're in production.
Regular checkups to make sure everything's in tip-top shape. So I've got security, performance, all super important. There's another factor that I think sometimes gets overlooked, but it's especially critical for a growing company, And that's reliability.
Oh, absolutely. Reliability goes hand in hand with those other two.
Yeah.
I mean, what good is a system that's fast and secure if it's always crashing or going down?
Especially these days, everyone expects things to be up and running 24/7. So how do you actually design a system that's not just, high performing, but also super reliable?
Redundancy, redundancy, redundancy.
Yeah.
Having backups of everything. The source talks about data replication, which is basically having multiple copies of your data in different places so that if one server goes down, you don't lose everything.
Like a safety net for your data.
Exactly. And then beyond that, having a solid disaster recovery plan.
That's something you hope you never have to use, but you're really glad you have it if something does go wrong.
Exactly. You got to think about all the what if scenarios,
Hmm.
natural disasters, cyber attacks, even just like a server failing and having a plan for how you're going to get back up and running as quickly as possible with minimal data loss.
That's like having good insurance, right? You hope you never need it, but it's there to protect you.
Exactly. And a well-designed architecture can make a huge difference in how smoothly that disaster recovery goes, how much downtime you experience.
This has been incredibly helpful. So much to think about. I mean, we've covered so much ground from the nitty gritty of microservices to these really essential pillars of any good architecture: security, performance, reliability. And I think what really stands out to me is that it's not just about the technology, it's about the people, the processes, anticipating what you're going to need down the road, not just today. One thing that really strikes me is just how, I don't know, holistic this whole thing of designing a company's architecture really is. It's not just about the code, it's about understanding your business, working together, thinking ahead, all of that.
Yeah. And speaking of thinking ahead, there's another piece of the puzzle that this source really highlights, and that's data architecture.
Yeah.
It's something that honestly, a lot of companies don't really think about until they're forced to. But as your IT company grows, it becomes more and more critical.
Yeah. I mean, data is basically the lifeblood of any company these days, but especially in the IT world, right? So, what are some of the key things to keep in mind when you're talking about designing a data architecture that can scale?
Well, just think about it. As your company gets bigger, you're going to have more data, different types of data coming from all different directions.
Mhm.
The source really emphasizes that you've got to choose the right tools for the job, database solutions that can handle that volume and variety of data.
So, it's not just about storing the data, it's about being able to actually use it, right?
Exactly. You want to be able to access it easily, analyze it, make decisions based on it. And that might mean implementing, say, a data warehouse where you can store and query all that historical data.
It's like having a gold mine of information just sitting there, but you need the right tools to actually dig it out.
Exactly. And of course, with all this data floating around, you've got to make sure it's secure.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask about because data breaches are a huge deal these days. And it seems like every other week we're hearing about some company that's gotten hacked.
You're telling me that's why data governance is so important, making sure the data is accurate, controlling who has access to what, complying with all the relevant privacy regulations. It's about building trust with your users, showing them that you take data security seriously.
Absolutely. And that kind of ties back to something we were talking about earlier about the importance of collaboration, especially in a, microservices world. Does the source have any practical tips for actually building that kind of collaborative environment where everyone's on the same page?
Communication is key. That's like the number one thing. Regular meetings, shared documentation, having the right tools in place, right, so that everyone can easily share information and stay up to date.
Breaking down those silos, right?
Exactly. And it's also helpful to establish, clear coding standards, best practices, that kind of thing.
So that even if different teams are working on different parts of the system, there's still a sense of consistency.
Exactly. It's all about creating that shared language, that unified approach.
This has been a really insightful deep dive, so much good stuff to think about. As we wrap up here, what are some of your final thoughts, key takeaways for our listeners who are in the thick of this whole defining their company's architecture thing?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's a journey, not a destination. Building a successful architecture is an ongoing process. You're always learning, adapting, making adjustments as you go. And it's about finding that balance between the technical stuff and the business side, understanding your company's specific needs and being able to anticipate what those needs are going to be down the road.
Not just building for today, building for tomorrow.
Exactly.
Well said. And with that, we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. As you're making these decisions about your technology, how can you make sure that it's not just supporting innovation, but actually enabling it, making it easier for your company to grow and thrive in this ever-changing world? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.